To introduce Yasser Elhariry. He is Assistant Professor of French at Dartmouth College. He is the author of Pacifist Invasions, Arabic Translation in the Post-Francophone Lyric, 2017 publication from Liverpool University Press, and the guest editor of a special issue on mysticism for Expression Maghrébine, winter 2017. With Edwidge Tamalat Talbayev, he is co-editor of a collection of essays on the modern Mediterranean titled Critically Mediterranean, Temporalities, Aesthetics, and Deployments of a Sea in Crisis, which is forthcoming from Palgrave in 2018 as part of their Mediterranean Perspective series. His essay, Abdelwahab Madhab, Sufi Poets and the New Francophone Lyric from 2016 was awarded the Modern Language Association's 53rd Annual William Riley Parker Prize for an outstanding article published in the PMLA. His writing appears in French Forum, Parade Sauvage, Contemporary French Civilization, Francospheres, Europe, and in several edited volumes. His second book explores post-language, sound poetics, love, eroticism, and mysticism in Franco-Arabic literature, poetry, and cinema from 1855 to the present. Yasser's talk today is titled How Wonderfully This Language Falls on the Ears, Post-Language, and Ahmad Faris al-Shidyaq's Leg Over Leg. Please join me in a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you, Rico. Thank you for the... I'm going to start right away. I'm just going to go Back to the Future, 1985.
Future? That's where you're going. That's right. 25 years into the future. I've always dreamed of seeing the future, looking beyond my years, seeing the progress of mankind. Where not? I'll also be able to see who wins the next 25 World Series. Doc. Huh? Look it up when you get there. Yeah, I will. Roll. I, Dr. Emmett Brown, am about to embark on an historic journey. I almost forgot to bring extra plutonium. How am I ever expect to get back? My God, my trip, I must be out of my mind. What is it, I? Oh my God. They found me. I don't know how, but they found me. Run for it, Marty! What do you think? Holy shit! I'm going fast!
What are the Libyans saying? Starting somewhere is most difficult when you're at the end, or near the end, as I am, at the end of a 6-year tenure clock, at the end of 10-year dossier submission, at the end of a purgatorial waiting period, infinite suspension. There, of course, remains a great deal to be said, to talk about, and never nearly enough time. On a personal level, I just published this book and have no idea what to do with myself. Like, what exactly am I supposed to be doing right now? I seem to think I'm writing a new book, which means I only have a title and a hunch and a few jolly taken notes. A Brooke prospectus, I presumptuously called it in my tenure dossier, which nearly certainly sentences me to imminent doom. A Brooke prospectus for a new book called Sounds of Eros, So it's on eroticism and mysticism, on sound, or maybe it's on love and post-language, what I'm prematurely calling post-language, in Franco-Arab, or what I'm too late in calling Franco-Arab literary culture. I think that's what I'm doing, but in all honesty, I have no idea. How could I? So my preamble takes a page from the playbook of Ahmad Faris, al-Shidyaq, who never ceased interfolding fact and fiction, auto-theory and fiction, pleonastic gluts of lingual excess, and the acute awareness of the raw material that is his human body and the grain of its voice in the world. His body, his tongue, his nostrils, his genitals, other people's genitals, all of our bits and pieces amount to no less than one of the most bulging oeuvres in the history of Arabic literary modernism. In the shadow of a giant, in the face of a giant, confronted with his beautiful pages, where do I begin now that I'm at the end, or near the end of a phase of writing, the near end of my career? How do we exit, how do we eject ourselves from the dominant intello-lingual paradigms of our eras and egos, personal and communal, private and public? So I guess I'll begin with two opening hooks. One, in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, in 1977, François Truffaut plays the role of Professeur Lacombe, who in his proto-80s round tint, half-tint sunglasses and incorrigible French intello accent plays the role of an inflected Sorbonnard, Normalien, come alien music language specialist. In a brilliant moment of visual, phonic, and subtitular lingual disjunction, Professeur Lacombe utters an aside, which for some reason remains untranslated in the subtitles for the presumably unknowledgeable reader. In his lingual back and forth between the CIA and his heavily bearded interpreter sidekick, slash sidekick, who kind of looks like a cross between Seth Rogen and Zach Galifianakis. Ce bilinguisme m'ennuie. It would be inappropriate to translate it and to attempt to translate Professeur Lacombe's ennui, though I just did. I guess what I want to say is that bilingualism is old news. That it bores me, that it bores my alter ego, Professeur Lacombe. Bilingualism bores aesthetically. Bilingualism, which is a form of multilingualism, as debates on multilingualism and world literature either rage on or come to an end, is over. It bores Truffaut, it bores Steven Spielberg. Two, my second book. I just said my alter ego, and my second opening has to do with eros and eroticism, which are inconceivable without at least one pair of doublings. For eros to be, there has to be at least one pair of doublings. Alter ego, because as we shall see in Shidyaq, authors and characters and all of their doppelgangers and doubles are multiple and myriad. From Plato to Baudelaire to Freud to Bataille, the erotics of desire and the desire for eros have involved at least one other thing, knowledge, say. One other person, a lover, perhaps, or one other idea both outside the self and contained within it, like mother, like death. Georges Bataille famously proclaimed, de l'érotisme, il est possible de dire qu'il est l'approbation de la vie jusque dans la mort, the approbation of life up in death, right? There's a sort of interiority of the don, the prepositional interiority in Bataille. In bleu du ciel, blue of the sky, or blue of noon sometimes, as it's translated, Bataille spreads sobs, tears, cries over its 200 pages. And in a shitty nightclub, his alter ego Tropman sticks a fork into the thigh of his object of desire and falls short of licking her blood. This is something that Lautréamont's alter ego, Moldoror, of which he sings, Homme, n'as-tu jamais goûté de ton son? Quand par hasard tu t'es coupé le doigt? Comme il est bon, n'est-ce pas? Car il n'a aucun goût. Man, have you ever licked your own blood? When by accident you cut your finger? It's so good, right? For it has no taste. Batailles are poetics of interiority, of insideness, of the sacramental, scatological. Sound as interiority, sound as mal, evil, by way of Baudelaire. Laughter is violence and violent rupture, to not say rapture. The son de la voix, the sound of the voice, permeates Baudelaire on Wine and Hashish throughout Paradis Artificiel and his wine poems. So I'd like to go deeper into Eros's others, the flip side of erotics, the erotics of desire, and the desire for Eros, specifically Eros's relationship with sound. Before I link it back to interlingual penetration in my final close reading, what is language if not half sound? What if sound if not time? Music is sound divided by time. Such is the voice, the singing voice, even the reading voice, as my own right now in this room before you. Roland Barthes insists that entendre est un phénomène physiologique, écouter est un acte psychologique. So hearing is a physiological act, listening is a psychological act. Jean-Luc Nancy reverses this, and for him, entendre is prêter l'oreille, to lend the ear, to give the ear, through the Latin auscultare, whereas entendre is comprendre. But I'm going to go with Barthes. For to hear me is to touch me, to speak to you is to touch you. You listen to me, I feel you hearing me. In hearing, if we closely listen to Barthes, it's touching. But listening closely to Barthes, if we are indeed listening as closely to Barthes as we are reading him, denotes three things. One, it denotes first an orientation to certain indices or indices, certain alerts or alerts, paying notice which the human and the animal share, like a rabbit in the fields or an owl in the blue of the sky and the moon. Two, listening denotes déchiffrement or deciphering, intercepting or capturing, capter, certain signs or signes. The human is not logos, but the deciphering of logos. Three, in the third moment, listening, and I quote, does not aim at or await certain determined classified sounds, not what is said or emitted, but who speaks, who emits. Such listening is supposed to develop in an intersubjective space. This is Bataille's don, where I am listening also means listen to me. What it seizes upon in order to transform and restore to the endless interplay of transference is a general signifying no longer conceivable without the determination of consciousness. In Barthes' system, listening separates human from animal, birdsong from poetry. I listen, writes Barthes, as I read according to certain codes. Which is to say the realm of the possible, the domain of the secret and of the sacred, just as I'm reading to you right now, just as you're most definitely hearing me and most certainly either listening or not listening to me right now. The singing voice, writes Roland Barthes, the reading voice in the Luncheon lecture, says I, and I quote, that very specific place in which a tongue encounters a voice and permits those who know how to listen to hear. That we can call grain. The singing voice is not the breath, souffle, and that breath, that question of breath is everywhere in wine poetry, whether it's from the Khamriyat, the Arabic wine poems, or in Baudelaire. It's not the breath, the souffle, but indeed that materiality of the body emerging from the throat. It's the French gosier. So gosier and souffle are coupled in wine poetry, in Baudelaire, and in translations of classical Arabic into French. So the throat, the gosier, a site where the phonic metal, and Baudelaire talks about the gosier métallique, the metallic throat of birds in the pages of the Paradis Artificiel when describing one of three phases of getting high. So the phonic metal hardens and takes shape, se découpe. That was Barthes, end quote. Elsewhere, Barthes calls this grain where language encounters a voice. In Leg Over Leg, the 1855 Arabic novel that was published in Paris that I promised the organizers of this luncheon lecture I would talk about, the author / narrator and doubled, squared, really quadrupled, because the book is in 4 parts, written by an author whose doppelganger, whose double is the narrator, who is actually also talking about someone else who is also the author, who in turn is split into male and female. And Nancy talks about listening as a quadrupling or a sextupling of the self. So in this book, the main character sketches a theory of eroticism that is firmly rooted in a sonic, semiotic vocabulary, not dissimilar from Barthes' division of the human, non-animal relationship to sound in terms of hearing and listening, and then the 3-part Barthesian division of the latter into noticing, deciphering, and transference, where I become you and where you become me. Pleasure in al-Shidyaq is divided into 5 divisions. The main character, al-Firyat's feminine counterpart, the Firyaiya, is the one that reports that pleasure may be divided in the following way, a long quote. The first is visualization of it, pleasure, before its occurrence. The second is a discussion of it before the same. The third is its actual realization, accompanied by these two essential elements. The fourth is the visualization of it after the act. The fifth is discussion of it afterward. Whether the pleasure of visualizing it is greater before it takes place or afterward is a matter of debate. Some believe that first is greater because when it hasn't yet happened, one's thoughts about it roam more widely, delve more deeply, and do not stop at any limit. Others claim that the actual occurrence provides one's thoughts with a known shape and a specific form as a benchmark against which to measure any replay or repetition. Similarly, there is disagreement over the times of its visualization, as also of its discussion, though the crucial point is the clearness of the visualization and the foulness of the tongue, end quote. So you have to talk dirty. A few words on Shidyaq are sort of in order here in order to begin slowly bringing together my two opening hooks, Professeur Lacombe's bilingual ennui, and the erotic and sonic proliferation of Shidyaq's fractally quadrupled alter egos. So you actually know very little about Shidyaq. He was born in Lebanon to a Maronite Catholic Christian family, 1801, 1803, 1804, 1805. So little and scarce is the early information on his life that for a long time scholars depended on leg over leg to glean biographical information on him. One of the first marked moments in his life when he was about 25. In 1825, his brother was working for American evangelical missionaries and converted to Protestantism. So he was jailed, tried, died, martyred, and Shidyaq anticipated trouble and fled with some of the Americans, first to Alexandria, then to British protectorate Malta, and he says terrible, terrible things about the Maltese, wherein he remained there for 14 years, never returned to Lebanon, save for a brief period in 1840. But from Malta, he goes to the fair British country, where he spends 9 years at Cambridge working on a translation of the Bible, while at the same time writing a refutation of the Gospels. And at the same, he kept a detailed travelogue of his British sojourn, says terrible things about the Brits, British food in 19th century Cambridge, and this is well before Yotam Ottolenghi. Of course, and Elhariry has a fantastic reading of the passage in his travelogues on the terrible food and beer and dirt roads come rivers of mud and muck and shit in Cambridge. But he describes Cambridge as this qarya mash'uma, this God-forsaken village, but shu'um is something closer to ennui in Arabic. And what's one of the interesting things about Shidyaq is that he's not so much born translated as he's born sort of counter. He's counter-discursive, counter-colonial, counter-oriental, counter-modern, in Keith Walker's expression. So, the Shidyaq, Firyaiyas, the narrator's scrutiny of British habits extends to English women. And what his female alter ego, the Firyaiyyan leg over leg, calls the 5 divisions of pleasure. So you gather that pleasure involves telling, retelling the act, a passage from hearing to listening. The telling and retelling are governed by a complex set of rules, most importantly, whom to discuss what kind of act, with whom and when to discuss and how often, how much to repeat it visually and verbally. So if you engage in dalliance with, quote, a man of high status at night, it must be discussed with a woman of high status at night, and vice versa, and etc. With specific regard to the English woman, the pleasure taken in reliving pleasure through its narrativization is mediated through an alternate semiotic system. So another long quote from Shidyaq. Every night, the Firyat would see the maid going up to the room of one of the lodgers. Then after a time, not longer than it takes to say, "Good evening," he would hear her produce a kineto-penetrative gasp. In Arabic, it's naghama ighafiyya. Naghama is a tone, it's not even a melody, it's a sound. And ighafa is the speed of flapping wings, it's the speed of the enemy approaching in a battle, according to Lisan al-Arab. Interesting enough, waqf, or ighaf, is the weakening of eyesight, and it's somehow linked to fucking, or nikah. So he hears this kineto-penetrative gasp. The mistress of the house used to see her coming down from the man's room at 10 or so at night, but had no interest in her ascents and descents. In the morning, when the girl came to make the Firyat's bed, he would stare at her and observe her closely, but could see no sign to indicate that she was the gasper. صاحبة النغم. He therefore assumed that it was a delusion born of his fervent desire for penetration, and Nancy writes that écouter, c'est entrer dans cette spatialité par laquelle en même temps je suis pénétré. So actually what's happening is that the firya is being penetrated by the sound, which is also a kind of emasculation of the male character. Then night would come, and the gasp would be there again, and so would his certainty. With morning, the staring would be repeated, as would the pretense of virtue. And the doubt would be there, and so would the confusion, and so on and so forth. Things got so bad that the firyat's mind almost became unhinged and started to spoil the translation, which he had long feared might fall victim to shortcomings and mistakes due to some issue related to women. Unquote. The alternation between the sonic and the ocular, between sound and sight, brings to the fore a fundamental shift away from issues of mimesis, ekphrasis, and representation, what Elhariry calls the Enlightenment's oculocentricity, in addition to, quote, the figurative framework of literary criticism and its emphasis on representation. Pleasure in Shidyaq's linguistic economy divorces sight from sound, sex from sight, and eros from linguistic and translational success, coupling it instead to failure, lack, abstinence, non-coupling or decoupling or uncoupling. It's the anti-couple, it's the anti-male. This renders British sexuality with its pretense of virtue, the desire to speak with, quote, clear and eloquent tongue of everything that happened, and the kind of pleasure that is the logical outcome of the preceding 2 points, incomplete, according to the rule pronounced by the Firyaiya, because it will lack the element of discussion. It will lack voice. It will lack sound. In Arabic, it is imperative, she says, that there be a flirtatious flash to the eyes, floods of saliva, filam fidyan, and in the classical Arabic poetic tradition, consuming, drinking. The departed beloved's saliva is the consummate erotic experience. So floods of saliva, a moistness to the tongue, and the hands sketch what the words describe. This being established, she continues, you will have gathered that the trait mentioned as present in Englishwomen is an infraction of the rules of pleasure. And it may be said that the pleasure they take in visualization is so strong because it takes the place of 2 other pleasures, or that they put their heads inside a cask or the like, or they just talk to themselves. End quote. I think it's stronger than that because it takes the pleasure of not 2 but 4 other pleasures. It's a pleasure squared, like the squared main characters. I mean, let's admit, are also just like total squares and language junkies. So pleasure to the power of 4. That's not the end of my talk, but this was really just all preamble to what I want to say about Postlanguage. So in about 8 more minutes, let's take a look at Leg Over Leg, Book 4, Chapter 11, which is called A Translation and Some Advice. The Firyat and the Firyaqiyya are now in Hertfordshire, close to Cambridge, where Samuel Lee, the author's collaborator and rector, is rector, and where the work concerning the translation of the Bible is being carried out at the rectory. It goes like this. One morning, after a few days had gone by, she came to the Firyat and said, how wonderfully this language falls on the ear. In Arabic, it's actually sama. It's the faculty of hearing and listening. And as far as I know, there is no distinction. There's no other word for listening or hearing, or one that distinguishes them in Arabic. But the translation is the ear, so metonymically, hearing, listening. How wonderfully this language, being English, falls on the ear and the mind. And how light it is on the tongue. Today I learned by heart a few lines of verse without any difficulty, except I didn't understand what they mean. Would you be kind enough to explain them to me? And then he says, but recite to me what you've learned. And so she said, and this is a marvelous sort of interfolding of the poetics of the muwashshahat, where it's the giving of the voice to the other. And so she says, and there's this remarkable moment in the text where we have 4 lines of poetry in English. Here they are. Up, 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 thou art wanted. She is weary and tormented. Do her justice, she is hunted. By her husband, she has fainted. What's going on? But what happens here, which is even more interesting than this sort of lingual eruption of English into the Arabic fabric of the text, is that it's followed by a transliteration into Arabic. A couple of things to mention. If we scan these lines metrically, they're imperfect. We have 7 syllables, 8, 8, 8. Right? Up, 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 thou art wanted. She is weary and tormented. So 7, 8, 8, 8. Here's how it sounds like in Arabic, or at least what I imagine the Arabic sounded like in transcription. So this, I don't know if this is light on the tongue. Ep. Vala art wanted. She is weary and tormented. Do her justice. She is hunted. Be her husband. She has fitted. Actually, what's really interesting in the transliteration is that it corrects that imperfect first those first 7 syllables. So the Arabic corrects the English, and it's difficult to say here what is a travesty of what. Are the monorhymes wanted, tormented, hunted, fainted a parody of classical Arabic poetics? Or is the transliteration, the transcription, a counter-colonial ridicule of English's imperfect prosody and of its limited rhymes and rhyme schemes when compared to Arabic? Another thing that's interesting here is that reading the Arabic, or the English dressed up in Arabic, the Arabic transliteration single-handedly reverses the classic observation that we can hear what we see. Like you can see a piano and you can hear it, but we cannot see what we hear. And here I'm wondering, am I seeing what I hear or hearing what I see? It's like ears have no eyelids. And so as a dutiful husband and man, the Firyaq explains, he mansplains her. I said, the poet complains here of some woman who has gone too far with him. I don't know who the woman is though, for it's in the same vein as, I'm just going to give you the English translation of he comes up with this beautiful Arabic verse. My silly wife wants me to plug both holes at once, but as the second opens up, the first shuts down. It's like the ear, and here we have udhun in Arabic. It's like the ear. If scratched, its twin starts itching, and will continue to do so until you give it its turn. The Firyaqiyya explodes. She says, you men are obsessed with plugging. The Firyaq explodes, just as you women are obsessed with opening. So in the midst of this steamy marital debate, and I say steamy because these are scenes of ear-scratching nuptial jousting, are in fact a form of verbal foreplay. It's written in saj'a, it's all rhymed prose in Arabic, and this is where erotic desire is negotiated, and in fact realized. This is the actual realization of pleasure, according to Firyaqiyya, that this is where this is always linked to eroticism, desire, intimacy, and sex in Shidyaq. And a literary lesson emerges in the middle of all of this. The Firyaqiyya says, these people, meaning the English, don't say such things, and their poetry doesn't contain the sort of obscenities and indecent language that are found in the poetry of the Arabs. The Firyaq retorts that, I quote, the celebrated Dean Swift wrote a long essay on the anus. Sterne is a similar case, for he too was a priest and wrote of body stuff. John Cleland once wrote a book recounting the doings of a harlot named Fanny Hill, in which he outdid in obscenity and bawdiness Ibn Hajjaj, Ibn Sari' al-Dila, and the author of Al-Layla wal-Layla, 1000 Nights and One Night. The first to follow the path of bawdiness, I believe, was the celebrated Frenchman Rabelais, who was also a man of the church. There's so much to say here, because of course we can and should go back further to the medieval fabuleux, but the French Renaissance suffices for the purposes of the Firyaq's illustration here. Let's perhaps retain, in terms of like Rabelais, that Gargantua is born out of Gargamel's left ear, that Gargamel's husband, Gargantua's father, Grand Gousier, so it's like the big-throated one, was so called for his insatiable capacity to drink alcohol. At the end of Shidyaq's chapter, the nonsensical, or what seemed at first like imperfect English, these verses are rendered in a regular Arabic meter with monorhymes. Here's the interpretation of them, I said, without further beating around the bush. قم عجلا قم سؤلي عندك وأبلغ أربا منها جهدك فلقد ضجرت ولها بعل يبغي أن يعسلها بعدك. Have at it, quickly have at it, my needs you know. So do your best to have your fun. She is bored and has a husband who wants to screw her once you're done. You said, she said, that the poet was complaining of a woman, but look, she's complaining of himself and his sexual insufficiency. And the woman's not to be blamed for being annoyed under such circumstances. To the likes of you, I said, so the Firyaq says, should be tossed the keys of linguistic interpretation, maqalid al-sharh, from which, she replied, may be expected relief after tribulation. After tribulation, takhfif al-barh. And al-barh is defined in the dictionaries as zal, the effacement and the lightning. So you're kind of, this is sort of coming, like a relief after tribulation, but there's also a lightning. Zala gives us Zalzala, which is a surah in the Quran, like an apocalyptic surah. إذا زلزلت الأرض زلزالها وأخرجت الأرض عشارها وقال الإنسان ما لها يومئذ تحدث أخبارها. So there's this lightning of the earth on the day of judgment, and that surah ends with an atom's measure of evil. If you commit an atom's measure of evil, of sin, you will see it. If you commit an atom's measure of virtue, you will see it. So this translation, this chapter ends here, from which she replied, maybe expected relief after tribulation. It ends with this apocalyptic sort of bouncing mattress. So this is beyond translation or untranslatability or boring bilingualism. This is beyond the strictures of bilingualism and its ennui, or even of multilingualism, as the text here operates uniquely at the liminal thresholds that separate poetic genres within a language from the poetic genres of another language. Lying within the erotic and mystical sound-based exit from the grammar, syntax, semantics, poetics, and prosody of literature, the gap between languages, where one language ends, where the other begins, where I end, where you begin, where we come together, is this which I need to denote by postlingual, for nowhere are the semiotic codes that overlap sound and sense more ripe for lingual reinvention than in heightened moments of awakened eroticism. So let's go back. What were those Libyans saying? So what were those Libyan terrorists saying? Here is what I think is the hidden transcript. This is David Cronenberg's 1991 spectacular adaptation of William Burroughs' Mega Punch. It's 5 minutes. So since you can't really hear what's going on, it's an Arabic typewriter called the Mujahideen that belongs to her husband, Tom Frost, who is gay and but yet is married to her. This is set in Tangiers.
You write something in Arabic? I don't like using Tom's things. We don't use them.
That is Majoun, confession ouverte.
It's fairly hard trying to see Listen. This is very good.
So I deliberately echo Shidyaq's own auto-evaluation at the close of leg over leg. It's actually a fake closing, right? He finishes off later time, anyway, with which I now close my talk. If that's what it was. Shidyaq writes, part 1 of the book, leg over leg, regarding the Firyat, ends here and will be followed by part 2. Once the author, through God's favor and generosity, has been stoned and crucified. Amen.
Thank you for such a phenomenal talk. Much to discuss. Questions? Comments? Perhaps I can start us off. You left with a sort of tantalizing clip, quite literally, from Cronenberg's film. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your reading of it.
Yeah. There's a lot to say. I won't get too much into the plot because it would take us the next 6 hours. The first time I saw this, I was just struck by what was being typed on the typewriter. It is gibberish for the most part, but because I'm insane, I will eventually transcribe the whole thing and figure out what is being said. The only thing that actually is correct Arabic in that sequence is on either the first or second line, but you only see it the second time they type on the typewriter and it says "La tunasibu," does not suit him. It's implied that it's she does not suit him, but it could also be the machine doesn't suit him. This is all new to me. There's certainly a queering of the machine and of the users of the machine. But really what I meant when this is the hidden transcript, I think this is what I meant, that this is the hidden transcript of what the Libyan terrorists were saying in Back to the Future. The character that plays the housekeeper, Fadila, leads a lesbian gang that produces a different kind of drug that is part of the market economy in the movie. I'm trying to find her name. She's a Canadian actress who speaks terrible Arabic, but what she says the exact same things that the terrorists say in Back to the Future, which is "Yalanak," damn you, fuck you. And there's this moment when the Libyan terrorists say, "Go, go." It's the only thing that they say in English, which I'm not sure why they say "go." They could have said "see it," which is what she tells the machine, يلعنك, damn you, sir, go away. That's all I have. But what I'm really interested in terms of the postlingual is what's actually happening with the typewriter. So I think I can read. I call it the hidden transcript of what was being said in Back to the Future, because I think that's what that's what the terrorists are saying. When what they're saying ends up being said by Fadila, the housekeeper, who's actually a man wearing a bodysuit, and that's the reveal in the end. Dr. Benway, MD, PhD, self-fashioned. And then there's also there's so many misrecognitions that happen throughout this. And so in the opening pages of Malheureuse, la condition humaine, the human condition, there's a scene where, I say they're Chinese revolutionaries, I'm terrible with history, but they sit around and they listen. They have two turntables and that they play at the same time. One turntable has a series of tones, of notes that is sounded at certain moments, and the other one is a recording of someone's voice. And to listen to the hidden message, you play both of them at the exact same time, and the message is what you hear when the tone is not playing. And the character who had recorded that voice was in that room listening and did not recognize his own voice. So I think through that relationship to misrecognizing your voice, we rarely ever hear ourselves. I'm talking a lot, so I don't know. But not recognizing your voice, and then for me, sort of bizarrely recognizing myself in these Libyans who are not translated, who are not transliterated. What happens on a lot of Hollywood movies is that it will say the subtitles, which I often turn on, will say speaking in Arabic. In X-Men Apocalypse, there's this cult around the original X-Men, who's a mummy who's unearthed in Egypt, and then there are these modern Egyptians who are praying to him. And what is totally hallucinatory is that these subtitles say chanting ancient Egyptian. It's actually dialectical Egyptian. It's like almost modern standard Arabic. And so again, the series of misrecognitions through sound, through the hidden transcript of Arabic. And I would even go as far back as Edmond Javès, when he first arrives in Paris, which is where he says, this is where I discovered Judaism. It wasn't in Egypt. Or this is where I discovered anti-Semitism, was in Paris and not in Egypt. He describes this graffito in the opening pages of Le Livre des Questions, the Book of Questions. And he talks about in interviews and essays throughout his life. Un soir, an evening, he's walking and he sees this graffito, this lit up by a passing car, and it says "Mort aux Juifs," so death to the Jews. And then an English translation, which to him is also totally hallucinatory: "Jews go home." So I think I don't know. I think that's what's going on over here. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm just.
I'm gonna go back to the early 19th century Lebanon and ask a very too plain or too simple question, because it has inspired so many poets and travelers and modes of multiplication of reality and the senses. And I was wondering if you have here also a kind of, not Bachelard-like, but a poetics of space going on with this kind of place of origin, or where origins multiply for most travelers and people who refer to it. I don't know if it makes sense, but I wanted to go back to not the beginnings, but the places where the text might have been modeled or imagined or.
And your second question?
Pardon?
You said you have two questions.
No.
Okay.
One. That's it.
I'm not sure. Shidyaq has this fantasy of origin and return, given his story. It's not something that I sense in this novel.
I was
or
thinking
this
about
in this
the
work.
opposite, actually, with Lebanon, a place of multiplication of,
Oh,
as opposed to return. So a kind
Sure.
of,
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question because I'm not working on Lebanon at all. I'm working on the Arabic literary tradition. I'm sorry. I might need to think a little bit more about that. I think I understand what you mean in terms of perhaps there's like Oriental travelers that you're thinking of, like the voyage en Orient.
absolutely,
Yes,
multiple evocations.
Yeah,
of-
but like I said, this is what I think the project that I should be engaging in is one that's a counter discourse. I don't really care about Nepal. I mean, I love Nepal, but I don't really care what he says about Egyptians. I don't care about, Flaubert, talking about, cunnilingus, prostitutes in Egypt. I'm interested in cunnilingus and Shidyaq. So I mean, I think I understand what you're saying, where you're coming from, and that's certainly a part of the Orientalist tradition, but that's, I don't want to say I don't care about it. I'm being deliberately provocative, but I don't. I mean, it's like Shidyaq, it's like Medeb, it's like Jabez. They master that tradition, but then do something completely different. One counter, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question at all. I mean, again, I don't work on questions of faith. I hear the Bashlab. I mean, I would rather go in the direction of Butor, and how he talks about sort of an hétérologie portative, sort of portable heterology. But not in relation to Europe or European travelers. I mean, I love talking about Rabelais, but in this context, we can talk more later. There was a question here.
I'm curious to hear a little more about the author's Bible translation project. Did he know Hebrew, or was he trying to learn it? Was this a counter translation he was trying to produce to something that was already there? And then in Arabic, I mean, and did it survive? Was it realized?
No, I don't know. I feel like what is more interesting, what comes out in this text, is that Shidyaq, the author, is more interested in dismantling Orientalist scholars in London, in Cambridge and Oxford. And so that passage that I ended, which was like the false ending, is followed by 200 pages of corrections, of critical editions of classical Arabic literature made by these scholars in Cambridge. So this is new work, so I haven't gone into the question of the Bible and what he does and what's going on there. I will. But again, also bear in mind that he converts to Islam later on. So he converts from Maronite Christianity to Protestantism. That's when he was in England, and then converts to Islam, ends up in Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, which is where he dies. There's a question about where he would be buried upon his death. So thank you for that, and I will look more into it. I'm sorry I don't have any more information on the Bible translation specifically. There's so many hands here. Yes,
I was curious about the term post-language. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit what that means and also whether it has any larger theoretical implications.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Maybe I'll take a couple of questions and try and answer them.
I was wondering if you could talk more about that moment in when the sound of the gas interferes with his translation. Or spoils, I think is the word you used, right? Almost spoils his translation. What is it about the gas that's causing this kind of interference? And is it like a sort of intermedial interference? Is it because he's trying to write and he has to deal with a sound? Or is it a sort of oral interference? Is he trying to hear the language that he's translating from, and then it gets interrupted by this other sound? Where is the interference happening? On what register?
Thank you. Christian?
So actually, I'm just going to build on the first question because I was listening to a question about the post-language term. And I just want to add a little bit of context that actually has a specific resonance within contemporary American poetry studies because there are post-language poets.
Yes.
Right? So I'm just curious, obviously different discourse, but just that it's there. But what I was wondering was, what I got out of the scene from the Burroughs through Cronenberg was yet another instance of an orifice that makes sound, right? Which, Naked Lunch is full of those. There's the talking asshole. And there's a long tradition of talking assholes going back to at least Randall, right? And so,
at least, yeah.
Yeah, right. I'm Rabelais, of course. there's something about post-language, it seems to me, or where you're gravitating around, that has to do with the noise made through the process of enunciation, right? It's not the subject of enunciation, it's the noise of enunciation. It's the phonic materiality, right? And so I guess I want to hear you build on that phonic material dimension because you focus on the transliterate dimension, so I just wanted to hear you go in that other direction.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I'll try and answer Anna's question first in terms of the interference. What is it about it? I think I would situate that strictly reverse. I would situate within the five-part sort of erotic system, that is this female counterpart that sketches out. At this particular moment, he's traveling on his own. He's not with her. In other moments in the text, they're together, as we see. So there's that, and this is always preceded by like, oh, forget what are you going to do when you're there? Oh, I'll meet some nice men. She's like, oh, it's not the men I'm worried about. So this is ongoing back and forth. So I think it's within that moment of isolation. He's on his own. He's supposed to be doing holy work, sacred work, and yet his mind's fixated elsewhere. I think that's what's going on, and I do find this interesting that it is sound. To come back now to transition to the other two questions. Post-language, specific. In this case, you're right to pick up on sort of the textual, literal, translingual, interlingual, translational aspect of it, because that's what I've done thus far. That was what my book was about, and the conclusion of my book is about post-francophone in particular, and that I situate within a specific poetic discourse in France, starting around the 1980s. And for the purpose of just sort of simplifying, faire vite, it's Jean-Marie Glaize's genealogy of modern poetry from the 19th century to the contemporary moment. So there's la poésie, which is like poetry as it is, it cannot be doubted, Baudelaire and Baudelaire, pour faire vite. Repoésie, néo-poésie, so the textual term, that would be néo-poésie, there's the work on form, the textual term, and there's post-poésie, which is what he is, which is what he does. So I use that to come up with a theory of the post-francophone. So looking at the genealogy of francophone literature, why poetry really is not part of it anymore, or is rarely discussed. And in the case of Medeb, for me, is an absolutely central case. I use that to make a case for the post-francophone, which is, again, to just put it very blunt, simply, it's not in French. It's like, it looks like it's French, but it is not French. I've yet to convince my French colleagues, my French poeticians about this, but that is my basic claim. Like, c'est terrible, on parle jamais une langue, on parle jamais qu'une langue, you never speak one language, you never speak only one language. And there were these moments when I'd be reading Saraseti, Tangour, Medeb, even Japanese poets like Ryoko Sekiguchi, and I'd be like, this is not French, this is something else. And so I was on a mission to sort of prove that and make that case. So that's what post-francophone is for me. And so with post-language, I'm wondering if I can take that elsewhere. Thank you for bringing up the language poets. I didn't really think about them, or in terms of post-language. I don't know. I'll have to look at it. But I mean, is it strictly monolingual? Is it bilingual? Is it multilingual? Is it translingual? And that for me is where interesting things happen. Specifically in terms of the postlingual, I mean, it's really going in the direction. I don't want to say nonsense. I don't want to say gibberish because I don't necessarily believe in any of those terms. But what happens when codes, like linguistic codes, semiotic codes, when signs break down, as we have over here, as we have in this passage of our Wanta, the Arabic transliteration. I mentioned the al-Shidyaq, 9th to 14th century Al-Andalus Iberian strophic genre, where the final, in some of the poems, the final one or two line exit, the kharja, would be transcribed, would be a language transcribed in a different language. So either Arabic or Hebrew, and it could be colloquial, it could be the transcription of colloquial Arabic, vernacular languages, Romance, and they remained garbled, if you will, and undeciphered for years until that's centuries, in fact, until it was discovered that that's what they were referring to. So that's really what I mean by post-language. It's not the post and post-language is an after the language poets. It's not what comes after. It's not the sort of space clearing gesture, if I may. It's not the paya. That's not at all what I have in mind. What was I going to say about post-language? Yes. So and then to pursue this further, it's almost taking us back to an earlier moment in history, the history of our humanity, of languages, where there were no strict separations between languages, when there even was no language that we can speak of. Right? So one text I really want to read is Abdel Fattah Lito's, La langue d'Adam, Lisan Adam, Adam's tongue. What language did Adam speak? What language was he speaking when she named all the animals? I think that's what I mean by post-language, really. It's going somewhere completely different. I don't know if that answers both of your questions, but that's just where I am.
Yes, you just mentioned a little bit, I feel I have to ask the question. The idea is, your idea of post-language, I'm wondering how that comes into play in the case of Ahmad, because, you know, he is like, I mean, in the Livre de Question, he was all about this idea of the Holocaust being something that he can underrate, right? And this character was actually autistic. And there's stuff like that going on between the writer trying to write about this autistic character and this autistic son of a certain woman who begins speaking on his own. And there's this idea of not being able to use language. But I think that it's also very tied to a certain kind of historical context, like the Holocaust, and even the Holocaust is something for Ahmad because it's a translated experience, right? This is something that he actually didn't experience himself. He comes from Egypt, right? He's not a European Jew. And I'm wondering how all these play out in a way that really fits into a political or historical context of larger situation.
So what fits in Jabez in particular?
Yes. Or maybe just...
Yeah. Well, let's start with Jabez. I mean, the Jabez that you described, and I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. That is also the French translation of Jabez. That is the French poetic sort of co-opting of Jabez, you know, canonized by a series of readings, or like Bonjour, Derrida, Levinas. But there's also that totally effaces, you know, half of his life, which was in Cairo. And so I am convinced, you know, that there's something going on in early Jabez and there's something going on in late Jabez. Then there's the Jabez that you're talking about. So that's my answer. And the archival documents all show a fascination with classical Arabic literature. This is something that just sort of bursts out of his last book, or his last two books, in the Book of Hospitality and Un étranger, a stranger with a small book, un étranger avec sous le bras, un livre de petit format. So in those cases, I am convinced that the images that come up in Jabez, the images that he used, and maybe it's hacky, I don't know, because it's sort of the imagery of the desert, it's the poetry of the desert, which is Arabic poetry, which let's not forget that is nomadic, is tribal poetry. That is absolutely present in Jabez. He spoke Arabic, he understood Arabic, he never wrote in it. He read it with difficulty. So that's the Jabez that I'm interested in, that I feel that I have something to say about. So that, I think that in a way maybe, I hope answers your question. Another thing about the question of translating the Holocaust, absolutely. I mean, Jabez is crushed, you know, by Adorno, and he says, you know, it's like, it's barbaric to write. I quote like it's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, or poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And Jabez deforms that. He himself doesn't remember what Adorno had said, which is why I am mixing it up right now. But he thinks one should and one must. It's from this blessure, this cassure that one must write. So that's Jabez for me. Yeah. In terms of is Jabez postlingual, we can talk about a postlingual Jabez. I don't think so. But I think there's something else going on in terms of translation, in terms of intertextual, in terms of translingualism. Absolutely.
Please join me in